Sam Chaltain began his career in teaching in New York City, teaching English and history. He co-directed a national network of schools, founded a leadership development program for K through 12 principals, and ran an education policy think tank. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, and his writings appeared in newspapers and magazines, including Forbes and the Washington Post. In our school, Sam Chaltain looks at 2 schools, Bancroft Elementary, a long-established neighborhood school, and Mundo Verde, a recently opened charter school. By exploring the classrooms, talking and listening to teachers, students, and parents, he charts the successes and failures of our current education system. While policymakers stress the importance of standardized testing, Sam's book reiterates the importance of engaging students with creativity and compassion. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful day, and help me welcome Sam Chaltain.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi, Sam. Hi, everybody. Let me just turn this on as a stopwatch. Thank you so much to Politics and Prose for the honor of coming back and doing an event for this new book, and to all of you for coming on what is really the first beautiful day of spring. We'll all get to go outside again in a little bit. So our school is the story of a year in the life of 2 schools here in DC and the people whose lives intersected there. But it's also the story of a lot more, and a lot of those issues are some of the most pressing issues of the day. It's about school choice, it's about teacher evaluations, it's about test-based accountability, but it's also about gentrification, and it's about our changing notions of community at this particular point in this city's history, in a story that I think has lots of implications for lots of other cities around the country. So that's a lot to talk about, and so that's the reason, obviously, I wrote a book, but it's also a lot to try to unpack over the course of the next 60 minutes. So what I was thinking of doing was I'm going to give 3 short readings from the book and try to do that as a way to give you a sense of the core characters there and how the story is framed. And then at that point, I'll let your questions determine how we spend the rest of the time. Sound good? All right. So the first reading I want to give is actually from the very beginning of the book, but it's from the very end of the year. So I spent the 2011-2012 school year in 2 schools, a first year charter school, now a third year, just finishing its 3rd year, the Mundo Verde School, and a 90-year-old neighborhood school, Bancroft. And so the very first words that you'll read in our school are the ones that I'm about to share, and they're from June. And so you'll hear the names of people that you don't yet know anything about, but it's safe to say that by the time you read the book and reach this point again at the end, you'll know a lot about them. Unlike the others who set off in teams to look for the twigs, branches, and leaves they would weave together to capture the essence of their school, Kristen Scotchmer searched the ground around her alone. She could count on one hand the moments she'd been completely alone since deciding to start a new school from scratch. But now it was June, and the inaugural year was over, and the staff of the Mundo Verde bilingual public charter school was completing its last shared activity before the official start of the summer, when the size of their team would double, when they would transport all the records and wires and playthings and poster boards to a new building across town, and when the glow of what had just been accomplished would start to fade in exchange for a renewed anxiety of all the new challenges to be overcome. Kristen leaned down and grabbed a branch, thin and moldable. This spot of Rock Creek Park was right next to the place she'd gone running all year to maintain her sense of balance, the only time of the week when no one could demand anything of her and there was no problem to solve. The teams returned to the clearing by the creek. Molly Howard was feeling ready for the year to be over. Berenice Pernalete was thinking about her summer adventure in Madrid that was just days away. And Dahlia Aguiar was steeling herself to be one of the ones to get in the water because that's what her dad would have expected of his Dolly. Before walking to the park from the school, which would soon revert to being just another floor in a downtown office building, Romy Pittman had shown them the artwork of Andy Goldsworthy. Each image she shared framed evanescent sculptures Goldsworthy made with only the materials nature provided, circles of reconstituted icicles, potholes along a stream filled with bright yellow dandelions, lines of white wool along a dark stone fence. The group decided their sculpture would be a circle of branches to reflect the spirit of the Oglala Lakota poem Dahlia had given them. In the circle, we are all equal. When in the circle, no one is in front of you, no one is behind you, no one is above you, no one is below you. Some bent stacks of sticks into shape, while others wove together the many gradients of green, grass, leaves, brush, into a long, crooked line that would, they decided, form a path to lay across the center of the circle. It was always the same, Romy thought as she watched these young women work, remembering the first cabin she and her husband had built and then lost to a fire the night they moved in. You gather your materials, you consult your plans, you make your decisions, and then you build the house. And now this is Bancroft. The Bancroft Elementary School parade began in a small park at the confluence of 5 streets and 3 neighborhoods, and in the shadow of 3 different church spires. For months, the weather had been cooler than usual, but by mid-morning in June, it was still hot enough to keep most of the adults huddled under the shade of the park's aging trees, each group swapping stories in a different mother tongue: Vietnamese, Spanish, Amharic, English. A police car idled at the base of the street that bore the name of the neighborhood it served, Mount Pleasant, and waited for the parade to begin. As her teachers orchestrated the final arrangements, cheerleaders up front, drum and bugle corps to follow, and flag bearers representing every nation in the community picking up the rear, 9-year-old Lourdes adjusted the yellow Nuestra Escuela t-shirt across her slight shoulders and grabbed hold of the large, wide Bancroft banner with 3 other students. As they walked to the front of the line, past a sea of adults holding cameras and camcorders, Lourdes knew not to look for familiar faces. She wouldn't see her dad until that summer, and in Texas, and she had learned long ago it was best not to think about where Mommy might be at any given moment. She watched the spinning lights at the top of the police car and imagined the parade was already over so she could be back on the soccer field, blazing down the sideline past all the boys to score another goal and show everyone how strong she really was. The police car started crawling up the street, and the cheerleaders began their rhythmic chant, "Bancroft!" The last remaining students and adults emerged from the shade of the trees to fall in line, while a phalanx of mothers with younger children formed an impromptu stroller brigade at the back. Lourdes watched the people gathering in interest as the parade progressed down the street. 3 heads poked out of a window above the 24-hour laundromat. A man with a lathered face got out of his chair to stand at the top step of the Pan American barber shop. An elderly woman sipped coffee from the porch of her aging Victorian, while younger children weaved their tricycles in between the foot traffic of the sidewalk. As they reached the midway point of the street, Lourdes could see the white canopies of the neighborhood farmers market, just past the Best World supermarket on one side of the street and the blackened facade of the burned-out apartment building on the other. 2 blocks away, Zakiya Reed was preparing the back of the school for the parade's arrival. Parent volunteers set up the barbecue pit and sorted the hamburgers, hot dogs, and churros for quick cooking. Another group set up the moon bounce just beyond the dunking booth. Her students always loved the chance to drop their principal into a tank of cold water. Miss Reed listened for the sound of the drums. The year had not gone the way she had hoped. She'd endured a painful public challenge to her leadership. She'd struggled to gain support from her staff for a new style of classroom teaching, and she'd learned that 2 of her best in that new style, the 2 Rebeccas, would not be returning. Yet there were days like this that always seemed to come along at just the right time to remind her why she became an educator. Days when a neighborhood's children and families would come together and remind each other that they were participating in the same dream, to unite all of the children of a single community under a single roof in order to give them all an equal shot at success. Part of what I do as a job, which is amazing, I'm so lucky, is I get to travel around the country and work with and in great schools of all kinds, K through 12, public charter, private, urban, suburban, rural, you name it. And so one of the reasons I decided to write this book was when I realized that in many respects, our city, DC, is the tip of a national spear of a very kind of brave new world of school reform. It's the school choice movement. I think most of us know that nationally, the number of kids that attend charter schools is very small, 3%. And we also probably know that here in DC, 44% of kids and rising are in charter schools. But it's not even that simple. So here in DC, if we use Bancroft as an example, half the kids that attended Bancroft Elementary School during the year that I was there lived out of boundary. So what's happening in DC, and to a lesser extent in other places across the country, is this great intra-city migration of students and families, all in search of a community that they can call their own. So part of why I wrote this was trying to answer the question, what is that setting in motion? And in what ways can that type of a movement deepen our ties to one another? And I think one thing that's clear is there's no way that that type of a movement can deepen our ties to one another if the conversations we have about schools and school choice and school reform remain as contentious and two-dimensional as they are now. And for those of you that are here that don't live and breathe schools the way some of us do, trust us. Any conversation about schooling is deeply contentious and two-dimensional. And people often want to immediately know, almost as a way of sizing you up, are you pro or anti-union? Are you pro or anti-Teach for America? Did you love or hate Michelle Rhee? And are you for or against charter schools? And part of what I've come to believe over the course of my own work is it's a lot more complicated than that. And so we don't even have a chance of reimagining education for a changing world and leveraging the creative power and the potential of something like school choice unless we develop a much deeper ability to see each other in three-dimensional terms. So this book is primarily an effort. I say it's about two schools. It's really about two classrooms. It's a third grade classroom at Bancroft. One of the teachers is here, Rebecca Schmidt, and their former principal, Zakia Reed, is here. And it's about a kindergarten classroom at Mundo Verde, whose executive director, Kristen Scotchmer, is here, and whose primary consultant and guide for professional development, Romy Pittman, is here, the person who came up with the initial idea of bringing in the artwork of Andy Goldsworthy to have the community create a shared sculpture that could be given to the new staff members as a way to represent what their community was about. Think about that. That's a pretty cool idea. And the picture, by the way, of the sculpture that I described is in the back of the book. But for the second reading, I want to, there's a number of main characters. I want to read two short intro descriptions of the two principals of the schools. This is from the first chapter of the book. It's appropriately titled The First Day because everything that happens in the first chapter is literally about the first days at each school. So now we're going back to the beginning. Zakia Reed updated the enrollment numbers on her clipboard as homeroom after homeroom filed out of the gym and into the wide hallways of her school. Things always changed over the summer. Families moved, families changed their minds, families got deported. And the first day of school was Miss Reed's first chance to get a more accurate head count. It was the least interesting part of her job with the most important ramifications. School budgets were determined by student enrollment. So until Miss Reed knew how many bodies she had in the building, she couldn't know how much money she'd have to spend on them. Over the summer, Miss Reed had spent her time obsessing over a different number, 38. That was the percentage of children at Bancroft reading at or above grade level. She wondered what her grandma would say if she were still alive, but she knew it would be direct and honest. Something like, "I don't mean you no harm, but what in the hell are y'all doing at that school?" Miss Reed wished she still had her grandma's advice to manage the year ahead. Mabel Ezekiel had raised two daughters out of nothing, and both had earned PhDs. She always knew how to push people, and she never got caught up in how people felt about her. Do what you have to do, and don't apologize for it. A year ago, Miss Reed had tried to do just that after learning about the Reading and Writing Project in New York City and seeing what it had done for children and schools across the country. This wasn't some fad of the moment. It was a proven model that had been applied by well-trained teachers in schools across the country for decades. I can't guarantee that our families will read to their children at night, she thought, but I can guarantee that our school is staffed by teachers who know how to help kids fall in love with language. It was the kind of choice her grandma would have encouraged her to make, and she'd made it, knowing it was going to ruffle some feathers, especially after replacing a woman who'd been Bancroft's principal for the previous 2 decades. Change was always difficult in schools. Asking teachers to change what they'd been doing over the course of their entire careers was something else entirely. Yet when she heard folks speak nostalgically about the way Bancroft used to be, she'd think, that's great, but we have a 38% reading proficiency. Miss Reed watched as the last homeroom left the gymnasium and updated the enrollment chart on her clipboard. She touched her belly instinctively, the baby inside her still too small to be felt. And this is Mundo Veri's principal. In the new apartment she'd moved into after the separation that was a long time coming, Dahlia Aguiar closed the bathroom door and quietly got herself ready so her young son could grab a few more minutes of sleep. She looked across the street at the buildings of the Walter Reed Medical Hospital, selected the outfit for her first day as a principal, blue shirt, tan pants, and sneakers, and thought back to the apartment in Corpus Christi she'd lived in as a child, the one on 6th Street with the roaches and the gunfire. That's where the wanting had begun. It started the first time she visited a friend's house on Ocean Drive. Why don't we have that? She remembered thinking. How can I get that? Her dad saw the change in his oldest daughter's face the following weeks, saw the building anger and resentment. There's a difference between being schooled and being smart, he said. Education is a bridge or a border. Choose. As a child, Dahlia often fished with her father. Leave it there, her dad would tell her when she recast too quickly. Wait it out, Dolly. Wait until it tugs. Learn to distinguish between the tide and a fish pulling on the lure. One time she felt a tug that left no doubt. Her father watched the rod dip. She tried to pull back with enough force. Daddy, I can't do this. Don't ever say that. The rod dipped lower and lower. Dahlia's father got behind her, added his hands to the pole, and screamed, "Reel it in!" The child strained as hard as she could until a stingray emerged, its wings wider than the rowboat in which they sat. The father grabbed it before it could strike and pinned it on the floor of the tipping craft. He reached in his boot for a pair of pliers, pulled the stinger off, and bellowed at his daughter to pull the hook out. In seconds, the ray was back out of the boat and struggling back down into the Gulf's greenish waters. Father and daughter lay there, exhausted and breathing hard. She felt like crying and laughing, then and now. He was always getting her into situations like that, situations that were bigger than she could handle, and then pushing her through them. That's what kept him alive, she thought, as she rustled her son from colorful 4-year-old dreams. He was making sure I had some of it in me. So it would not surprise me if some of you were thinking, this doesn't sound like a book about schools. And part of that is because in writing it, my conclusion was that people aren't interested in programs. People are interested in people. And so if you want to read a book that explains the ins and outs of Lucy Calkins' Readers and Writers Workshop, there are other books that can do so. But if you want to get a much deeper understanding of what it's really like to be a teacher or a principal in a city like DC right now, then it seems to me the personal lives and memories and experiences of those professionals is as relevant as their professional work. And not for nothing, but as all of us think about what we ultimately want our teachers to be doing in schools, we are in the midst right now of the most radical redefinition of what it means to be a teacher in over a century. And I can sum it up pretty much like this. In the past, for almost everybody that's above a certain age in this room, the clear end goal of schooling was content knowledge. You went to school to acquire knowledge, and the best way you acquired it was by memorizing it. We are now at a phase where this has changed everything vis-a-vis our relationship to content knowledge. And so the shift is moving to a world where content is merely the means by which we achieve the end goal of schooling, which is a much more customizable set of skills, habits, and dispositions that can guide the young people in this room through life. At the same time, we're in the midst of this transition away from the notion where it was the job for all of us above a certain age, I think I can speak for most of you, the job of you as a student was to adjust to the needs of your school. We are now in a situation where the job of the schools of the children in this room is to adjust to the needs of these children. And personally, I think that's right, but it's a lot harder to do as a teacher. And so through the course of this book, you're going to see the ways in which those teachers struggle to fulfill and succeed in fulfilling that mandate. But because I know a lot of people that are here right now are also parents, it's also a lot harder as a parent if you're encountering a world like this, where suddenly in 2011, 2012, it wasn't just 12 schools. It was, I mean, I suppose you could apply to what, 80? I mean, you could go 80 for 80 or 0 for 80. Now it's at least you can only apply to 12 and you only get into one, which, by the way, is a pretty quick policy shift in just a few years. But it's hard for parents to better understand what's going on. So the last reading I want to share before we go to your questions and decide how we'll spend the rest of our time is later in the book, where it's following one of two parents that I followed. Now, I should say, when I wrote this book, my wife and I were going through the exact same experience of the parents I wrote about. Our son was about to enter school in the fall of 2012, and so we were attending lots of open houses and trying to figure it out ourselves. But I followed two parents intimately throughout that whole experience. And this last reading is one of those parents, a woman named Karen Copeland, and this is when she is attending the enrollment open house, which coincidentally, some good friends of ours just attended the enrollment open house of Mundo Verde this morning. So I'm sure there are some people out there who have just gone through this experience. The only thing you need to know about Karen is she's always been a little skeptical about this whole school choice thing. By the time Karen Copeland received the postcard in the mail saying her daughter had won a preschool seat at one of DC's newest charter schools, she had just about given up hope. Every other school had drawn Leah's name so far after the cutoff as to become comic. She hadn't even attended an open house for the school whose offer of admission she now held in her hand. But as she thumbed through the folder of handouts from the Charter School Expo, she started to remember being impressed by the school, Creative Minds International, and by its charismatic founding principal. She found the school's glossy handout. Opening, fall 2012, it read, alongside the color images of two children's faces. New international public charter school with arts, foreign languages, and hands-on project-based learning. Creative Minds International Public Charter School is a new tuition-free school for children in Washington, D.C. Creative Minds International offers an engaging, diverse, international curriculum with project and arts-based activities that foster creativity, self-motivation, social and emotional development, as well as academic excellence. How can a school say it offers something, she thought, if it doesn't even exist? Then she read more about the school, IMAX in every classroom, an emphasis on the arts, and a founding principal with a PhD and a deep understanding about how children learn. And in spite of herself, Karen Copeland started to feel the fortune of her winning number. She also had no other options, a fact that tempered her enthusiasm when she attended a special open house for admitted families the following week. This is the actual reality of school choice, she told me as we entered the school's facilities to pick up Leah's enrollment pack. It's school chance. The most established charter schools have stopped being anything other than a lottery ticket for families because most of the spots for the younger grades are taken up by siblings. That means for those of us who still want to play the game, the best options are the unproven schools, the ones that sound great on paper and that may actually become great, but which don't yet exist in any real form. You're buying low and hoping the stock will jump. As Karen walked in the school's first-year front doors, just off a busy stretch of 16th Street in Columbia Heights, she saw other families coming in to submit their enrollment materials. The foyer still featured the mottos and posters of the building's current tenant, a charter high school that was about to move across town. One set of parents brought their son with them. "I don't like it," he said, moments after entering, at which point his father knelt down beside him. "This isn't the school yet," he said. The boy stared back blankly. "What is it then?" Nearby, another parent handed over her daughter's materials and gave the young female teacher on the other side of the table a bear hug. "If you all need help getting ready for the fall, just let me know." "That gives me goosebumps," the teacher responded. "I think I might cry." Karen moved through the entryway and into a large room where Creative Minds principal was addressing prospective families. "I'm wondering how much balance you'll be able to maintain once the school year actually starts," Karen said, arms crossed. "Leah's got 17 plus years of schooling ahead of her. I don't want her to get pushed too quickly into an academic focus." "I know exactly what you mean," the principal responded. "I started this school out of the same frustrations I'd felt when I was searching for a school for my son several years ago. That's why we want to make sure our teachers are just as focused on addressing the social and emotional needs of our children as they are on their academics." Karen watched the other parents around her nod in affirmation at what they heard. Are these future friends? Will Leah be spending time at these people's homes? Should I believe what this principal is telling me? We left shortly thereafter. Karen thumbed through the enrollment package outside the school's front doors. Request for records, race and ethnicity data collection, home language survey, emergency contact information, residency verification. "I get excited every time I learn more about the school," Karen said. "But at the same time, did you see how young those teachers were in there? I worry that what's happening is that the rising expectations of the parents and the increased understanding of the research has outstripped the capacity of the teachers to actually deliver the goods. Some of what I heard in there sounded like an election speech. It all sounds good in theory, but what will it look like in practice? And do I want Leah to be a part of the experiment?" The more I think about it, I'm not as concerned that they're a new school. It's preschool. By the time she gets into first grade, they'll have worked out the kinks. I go back and forth on where my priorities are. On one level, I say, let's try this, and I'm okay with her switching schools a few times. But I also can't help but think about the tumult down the line. It's a leap of faith, but I suppose that's true anywhere. She unlocked her car to drive back home, 2 miles to the east. "I think we'll still move out of the city," she mused, "just not right away." So, not by coincidence, the frontispiece at the beginning of this book is a line from Plato's Republic. And for those of you who, I'm assuming it's most of you, because I had never read Plato's Republic until I was doing this book, it's a book that's about Socrates visiting Athens right at its period of decline. So this is now the crumbling, formerly great democracy. And basically Socrates and some other guys, and it is guys, start riffing on a street corner about what the ideal city should be. And as you might expect, in figuring out what the ideal city should be, they spend a lot of time thinking about the role of schools. And so the paraphrase of the quote at the beginning of the book is where Socrates is asking the question of the group, but how will they be reared and educated by us? And how is our ability to answer that question relating to everything else that we're considering? In what way justice and injustice come into being in a city? And to me, that's the question right now for all of us. In what way justice and injustice come into being in a city? In what ways does this current experiment with school choice and school reform in DC, a relatively uninterrupted stretch of school reform that's very rare for cities across the country, in what ways is it putting us in a position to come closer to fulfilling the as yet unfulfilled mandate of our country of creating a more equitable, harmonious, and just society? And how on earth, in a situation of schools, do we balance the tension between the me and the we? Not for nothing, but Socrates' solution to how we balance the me and the we is we raise children in a common pen. And that way, nobody knows who these children's parents are, and therefore we all feel an equal stake in all of their success. I mentioned this recently on the Kojo Nnamdi show, and apparently there are some people on the DC Urban Moms listserv who thought I was putting it forward as a policy proposal. I was not, but it does speak to the level of the problem, does it not? That 2,500 years ago, the solution of some of the finest thinkers in the history of humankind was to raise children in common. And so it's not lost on me, and I'm sure it's not lost on you, that as we're in the midst of an election year in DC, as we're in the midst of very active citywide debates over proposed new boundaries, and as we continue to try to wrestle with how to provide quality options for every child, we're in the midst of trying to wrestle with some painful and age-old questions of how close do we really want to be. The last thing I will say is I don't think our school answers all of those questions, but I do think it's my best effort to try to put us in a position to have a more informed conversation about the state of education reform in DC as it is, good, bad, and ugly, so that we can start to focus more specifically on what it ought to be. And I think that's a good spot for me to stop and see what questions and ideas do you have and would you like to talk about in the time that we have left. So thank you. Who's got something to say?
All right, I'll start with an easy one. Do you think test scores are rising?
I'll give you the yes, no, and then I'm going to give you what I really think. If I had to say in response to that question, are test scores rising, yes or no, I'll say yes. Now let me say what I really think. So I talk about testing a lot in this book. It's a key issue. And for me, what we're doing right now is, well, actually, we're in a bookstore, so I can say, Ray Carver, raise your hand if you know the short story writer, Ray Carver. Anybody? Okay, well, if you don't, you're in the right place. So go over to fiction. Ray Carver is one of the country's greatest short story writers. I would put him and Flannery O'Connor in their own category. And Ray Carver has a collection of short stories called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And what Carver's characters are always kind of down on their luck folks, and so there's one story where that's the title, and what he's getting at is these are people that for a variety of reasons are not able to directly look into the faces of one another and to directly confront all of the pain, joy, triumph of their own emotional legacies, like a lot of us. So they talk about the weather instead of talking about love. Test scores are what we talk about when we talk about school reform. We can't yet figure out how to fully capture the complexity of what unfolds in an environment where the primary currency of success is the quality of relationships between adults and adults, adults and children, and children and children. Philosopher Karl Popper said, life is not a clock, it's a cloud. Highly irregular, random. School reform is not a clock, it's a cloud. But tests allow us to pretend that it's a clock and that test scores are rising or falling. Now, don't get me wrong, literacy and numeracy is important. We should pay attention to those things in schools. But the fact that right now it is, in effect, the only measure of success, although we're starting to get better and the pendulum is starting to swing the other way, is the equivalent of me becoming the general manager of the Washington Nationals and saying, from now on, I will only recruit players based on the number of doubles that they've hit. The number of doubles a player hits is, I mean, more is better than not a lot, but if you're only picking a player based on doubles, you're missing lots of valuable information. Part of the reason, too, in the description I wrote about the people and sharing all of their personal experiences is because what we want our teachers to do is know our children as thoroughly as those descriptions were hopefully beginning to let you feel like you were starting to know those characters. And test scores is the equivalent of taking someone's temperature, but just because you find out you have a fever doesn't mean you know why the person is sick. And just because you don't have a fever, let's say a community where test scores is high, doesn't mean nothing is wrong. You need other information in order to better make a judgment. And so one of the things that I'm most hopeful for in the next stages of school reform in DC is that we'll start to get closer and closer to a much more holistic understanding of the ways in which we need children to develop and grow, and the things that we can look at to better determine how we can recalibrate our learning environments to help kids learn and grow better. Other questions?
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Cosby.
This is a tough time to be a teacher, as you said, and are we at the end of a really bad phase of teacher turnover, or is this just going to be how it is for a while? So my question is, how can we turn around this teacher turnover thing?
I'm going to answer that question, and then I want to give some of the people whose stories make up this book a chance to also weigh in if they'd like to. So one of the main things that I observed at the end of this year, so as it was said at the beginning when I was being introduced, I started my career as a teacher in New York City. I am the statistic. I taught for 5 years and then I left. And I left because I was burned out. There was absolutely no way that I could continue to do the work. I knew that I wanted to stay in education, and I knew that if I stayed in the classroom, I wouldn't be the colleagues that I looked at who were 25-year veterans who were master teachers and amazing. I would be my other colleagues who were 25-year veterans who should have left 20 years ago. And so part of why, selfishly, part of what I was interested in doing in writing this book was getting a much deeper on-the-ground reminder of what it's like to be a teacher. And I don't know if Rebecca will agree with this, but one of the things that became clear to me is teaching remains unsustainable. It's unsustainable work for all but a very few of us. And it's more unsustainable now than it was when I was a teacher because it's a lot harder to do now. And again, the ways in which I think it's changing to try to focus on more developmental needs of kids is healthy. But when you're trying to do that amidst a policy framework that still only cares about test scores, there's a massive misalignment. So it's, not for nothing that of the 4 classroom teachers I write about over the course of this year, only 1 is still at the same school. And of those teachers during that year, Rebecca was the most experienced as a 5-year veteran at the time, I think. Yeah. So I think that's one of the main things that we have a lot of reckoning to do, and the only way we can resolve it is if we get a better alignment between what we are preparing and expecting our teachers to do in the classroom and how we're evaluating and supporting them in doing so. I wonder if Rebecca or Zakia or Kristen or Romy want to weigh in on that as well. Could you use a microphone? Yeah, why don't you guys come up here and... Rebecca Schmidt, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon. So I agree with everything you said about teacher retention. I think one other thing I would say is that in most schools, teachers are teachers and then you have administrators. And there's not a lot of other things to do besides teaching. And it does take up a lot of time, and there's not a teacher out there, I think, that's like, yes, give me more work to do. I would like something else. But, excuse me, but I would say that after a couple of years in the same position, anyone would feel like, okay, I'm ready for a new challenge, or maybe a different kind of work, or maybe like something else in addition to what I'm doing to make me feel like I'm growing as a teacher or as a professional in general. And I think a lot of teachers get to that point after about 5 years where you do feel like, okay, this has been great. What else is there? And to be honest, in a lot of schools, even if you're a department head or you become in charge of the, soccer team, it doesn't feel as fulfilling as other professions where there's more opportunities for growth, I guess I would say that. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous in front of a lot of adults. I'm used to little guys, so I guess that would be one thing I would add to that. keeping teachers in a position is hard if that's sort of what they're expected to do every single year for 20 years. I think that would get sort of old for a lot of people. A few absolutely can, bring in enough zest every year and keep going and be excited about it. But I think that for a lot of people, it is a hard profession to stay in and not grow or not feel like you're growing, I guess.
Thanks. It's also one I would say real quick, I don't think a lot of people really understand what it takes. And I really do hope, if nothing else, I hope that people read this book and they're like, oh, okay, that's not what I thought being a teacher was like. The workday does not end at 3. It's not taking summers off. It's imagine 5 high stakes presentations 5 times a day, high quality, high intense relationships with more than 100 adults and young people. How would you feel after a few years of doing that? And how would you feel after a few years of doing that when the larger climate pretends to respect teachers, but let's be honest, doesn't really? When I was teaching, I literally had a guy say to me at a dinner party, and he didn't even understand what he was doing. He found out I was a teacher, and he's like, oh, well, you know what they say. And it didn't, even after he said it, it didn't even occur to him that what he had said was insulting to me. And I was like, wow. I mean, so there's a lot of that. And there's no way that we can really invest appropriately in our schools unless we figure out ways to really recognize the humanity and the effort of what our teachers are doing in schools.
You made the statement that in addition to literacy and numeracy, there's a lot else. 2 questions to get you to expand on the what else. There's a professor in Virginia, I think. Most people here know his name. I can't remember it, but he has come up with what he thinks is the necessary content. Puts the guys.
Edie Hirsch.
Yeah. So, what do you think of his position, both in terms of the balance of of the numeracy and literacy, and also his approach to it? And another question, really big right now, is the Common Core. I know that it's getting started, and there's a lot of people are very critical because it hasn't been established, and that's understandable. But would you talk about Common Core, and is that what you're talking about in the other aspects of learning?
So, real quick, group exercise. All right, let's use the young people in the room as our collective focal point. Let's imagine that we took Socrates up on his offer, and they belong equally to all of us, so we all feel a vested stake. Off the top of your heads, what are the things that are most important to instill in these young people if our schools are going to be really successful in preparing them? What are the first things that come into your mind? Anybody? Empathy? Wow. All right. Empathy. Adaptability. Curiosity. Grit. Resilience. Creativity. Knowledge. Respect. Problem solving. Accountability. Hey, confidence. We'll stop there. Now, will you believe me? Will you take me at my word if I tell you that I could have done that same exercise in any community with any demographic profile, and the things that people would have said would have basically been the same? Okay? Trust me, it's true. Are our schools currently aligned to produce the outcomes that this group immediately crowdsourced as the optimal goals of schooling? Well, part of the reason is because, as I said before, we've we're in the midst of a shift away from the notion that content knowledge is the ultimate end goal to the means by which the end. So if I use E.D. Hirsch as the example, I'll say something that might be a little heretical to two people. I'm going to take two established comprehensive school reform models and imagine them being fused together as the ideal vision. So E.D. Hirsch is actually a pretty progressive professor who's been painted as a hardcore conservative by lots of progressive educators, because his belief is that the only way you create really healthy, high-functioning schools is by having really high-quality content that can be delivered by highly effective teachers. So if we just take, that's his basic premise. And so his program, it's called Core Knowledge, and they have a very specific, pretty tightly scripted curriculum going all the way through middle school, maybe high school, I'm not sure, certainly through middle school. And they've done a lot of thought about what that content should be. I can live with it, personally. I can live with it. I'm also fine with the idea of somebody else creating their own. But core knowledge by itself, no. Then on the other side, there's a guy named James Comer, 77-year-old African-American professor of child psychiatry at Yale, who first tested a theory over 40 years ago that was, if you want to help a community of children really learn and grow, then all of the adults in that community, from teachers to bus drivers to parents, need to understand the developmental needs of children. And Comer was talking about cognitive, but he was also talking about 5 other neurodevelopmental pathways: ethical, physical, linguistic, social, and emotional. And if you have a community of adults that don't understand the cognitive, ethical, physical, linguistic, social, and emotional needs of kids, you're kidding yourself. And you're going to have a system that pretends that the measure of success is reading and math scores. So my ideal vision, or something, in a Cliff Notes version, would be a community of adults with the training and the sensibility of the developmental needs of kids that Comer advocates, and a really high-quality curriculum that E.D. Hirsch has promoted. It's not quite that simple, but for the purposes of responding to your question, I can live with that. As far as Common Core is concerned, so in theory, if we look around the world at some of the other countries that are best performing, Linda Darling Hammond, for me, is one of my personal heroes and mentors, and a real hero of the progressive left. Linda was the first person to make me aware of the fact that if you look at other countries like Finland, most of them have some type of national standards. They don't have national tests, but they have a set of national standards and then highly qualified teachers that decide how to breathe life into those standards. So I'm willing to believe, personally, that the effort to get Common Core, there are other motives, but one of them is certainly a desire to provide a greater amount of quality control that can unleash better thinking. But that's not really, again, what we talk about when we talk about school reform, the debate over Common Core is not really, in my mind, a debate over standards. It's a debate over the age-old tension of don't tread on me, which is not a Civil War cry, it's a Revolutionary War cry. So we have a unique challenge in this country in trying to foster something shared while maintaining our sense of independence. I'm producing a film right now for PBS, and it's about South Carolina. Man, I mean, South Carolina is like going crazy over Common Core. And I mean, first state to secede from the Union, not for nothing. But what the governor said was, she's like, I don't want South Carolina kids being educated the way California kids are. Now, it's an election year there, too. That's a very powerful election year message if you're running for governor of South Carolina. So Indiana is one of the states that originally opted in that has now opted out. I think we're about to see the floodgates opening where folks find that it's just too politically hot to maintain a commitment to Common Core. And I'm guessing what will happen is that lots of states update their standards to something Common Core-esque, and they call it something else. But to me, the bigger problem is the fact that we can't even get to deciding whether or not that's the appropriate policy lever, because there are still so many deep-rooted, unresolved emotional issues with ourselves, with one another, and with what it means to be an American, with what it means to attend public school, with what it means to honor our dual allegiance to liberty and equality, that we can't actually follow through on any of that, for what it's worth.
Hello. I wanted to take us back to professional development really quickly. At the end of your book, you talk a little bit about a vision of having learning and development equally important to teacher training. And especially since you've traveled all over the U.S. to see outstanding schools, I'd be really curious to hear more about some bright spots, both in D.C. and nationally, in terms of teacher training for this new world where empathy and all these other skills are becoming more important.
You got it. That's Laura White, by the way. Anybody that said empathy, Laura works for Ashoka and is building a national network of schools that are committed to making empathy the foundation of what they do. So find Laura afterwards. So yeah, the learning development thing, that also came from Comer. So Dr. Comer, he's an MD. So he was in medical school. He planned on becoming a doctor, and he grew up poor, lower class, African American, and highly successful family. His parents were both working class. Between him and his siblings, they've got like 37 degrees. And a lot of his friends growing up didn't make it. And so what stopped Comer from going on the path to become a doctor was he was like, wait, why did I make it and they didn't? Because they were just as smart as I was. And his conclusion was that what happened is they were underdeveloped, that their parents were doing the best that they could given the situations of what they were living in to try to give them everything that they needed, but they were missing some things that kind of truncated their ability to really launch. And that's why Comer got into schools. And so one of the things he said to me is, here's the thing. Any doctor can go to any med school across the country, and you'll choose different med schools for different reasons. There are different strengths to each. But there's a foundation for all physicians, which is 2 courses, anatomy and physiology. You may have different points of emphasis, but you all take anatomy and physiology. And so what Comer said to me, and I had never thought of it this way, he's like, why is there no equivalent for learning how to be a teacher? I mean, a dual foundation in developmental sciences and learning sciences. Let's understand really well how children develop. Let's understand really well how the brain works. And if we did that, there's lots of other things we have to do, but that would be a good start. That works for me. And there are other things. I try to leave myself out of the book entirely until the epilogue, and then the epilogue I say exactly what I think needs to happen. And so that's one of the things that I talk about. The only other thing I'll say real quick is another example. There's a great school in San Diego called High Tech High. 2 schools. And what High Tech High does that I've never seen any other school do is they have a master's program for teachers housed at the school. A fully accredited master's program in teaching housed at the school. So imagine you want to become a teacher and you spend your entire time at a school in classrooms practicing what you learned, theory and practice coming together. That just makes so much sense. I don't understand why we don't have more things like that. The other one I'll say real quick is there's a wonderful school in Boston called the Mission Hill School. And I bring it up because I helped produce a 10-part web video series about that school. So if you go to ayearatmissionhill.com, you can learn a lot about, or at least see a lot about the ways in which that school has created a deeply collaborative environment of teachers, which is the other key piece. All of these ideas about trying to use cash incentives to motivate teachers in order to do well, don't get me wrong, teachers need to make more money, and incentives help. But by nature, teaching is a deeply collaborative profession. So if there are any incentives that disincentivize teachers from behaving collaboratively, what are we doing? So one of the things that Mission Hill does really well, and you see it through the course of that series, is they create a really supportive, high trust, high transparency, collaborative environment for teachers. And so as a result, those teachers there are always empowered to do their best work, and nobody feels like they're doing it, you know, kind of isolated in their own classroom.
We need to wrap up.
Yep.
So if everybody who's in line right now wants to ask your question, then maybe you could just at one point see if you can answer all of their questions.
Hi, my son and daughter went to Bancroft, and I'm curious about the title of your book. It says Our School, as in one school, and you were talking about that common pen. I sometimes, though, don't think that here in D.C. we have a common care for all of the children in D.C. it's about where my child is going to school. It's not really our school or our district. Do you have any wisdom about how we could form a community more for our whole district so that we do care about the kids who are living in the DC General Hospital and having to go to public schools? And I don't live in that. How can we be together?
Okay.
All right. My question, I think, goes at your answer to the question on the Common Core. What's your opinion of the school administration? I think the school system costs us a lot of money. Why aren't we getting quality for the money? Where does the money go that it's not producing a quality school system? I ask the question because, in my opinion, DC will never be a successful community until we do have an excellent school system. It's the basis for the economy simply requires a well-educated workforce, and until we can produce our own workforce, we're never going to make it.
All right. Let me answer those in reverse order. So why aren't we getting quality? First of all, let me clarify something. So because I get to visit lots of schools and lots of communities, I feel pretty confident in saying that most schools in this country, and that includes DC, are pretty good. Very few schools are really great, and I'm including private schools in this. And very few schools are really horrible. Most are pretty good, and they're somewhere along the continuum of pretty good. They're pretty good closer to not that good, or they're pretty good closer to almost great. So let's start with that as the assumption. Now, why aren't we getting more quality? Why aren't we moving more schools along the continuum of pretty good? Because what we are largely doing from a policy perspective is perfecting our ability to succeed in a system that no longer serves our interests. We are devising elaborate, highly paid for plans to move the needle on closing the achievement gap when all the achievement gap references is the reading and math scores between white kids, black and brown kids. Not saying that isn't important, but if the only goal is to close the achievement gap, based on our current methods, we'll do it in about 600 years. If the goal is somehow to recognize that public education is the only institution guaranteed to reach 90% of every succeeding generation, the only institution that was founded with the explicit mission of preparing young people to be active and productive citizens in a democracy, and if we realize that there are certain fundamental tenets of that system that have perpetuated race and class-based inequality, let's start with property taxes. Okay? I talk about this a little bit in the book. Raise your hand if you've heard of Brown versus Board of Education. All right. Raise your hand if you've heard of San Antonio versus Rodriguez. Sabrina. Yeah. Real quick, 1973, a group of poor Texas parents bring suit claiming that the way in which Texas funds their schools is a violation of the 14th Amendment. And because it's literally preventing us from due process and equal access. 5-4 Supreme Court decision. So just to be clear, we're that close in 1973 to overturning the way that this country has always funded schools by property taxes. And in the majority opinion, the justices conceded that the way that Texas funded its schools was chaotic and unjust. That's a direct quote. But, they said, that doesn't mean that we can read something into the Constitution that isn't there. At which point, Thurgood Marshall, the guy who was the lawyer for Brown versus Board and now was the first African-American justice sitting on the court, said, "Are you kidding me? If we can't read that education is a fundamental right in this country and the greatest means by which we can ensure greater equity and equality, then what on earth are we doing?" So there's no way, I think, that we can fully get at the inequities that public school is part of and cannot fully address if we leave other aspects like this untouched. Now, we're in a very interesting point in a citywide conversation because these proposed boundary changes, and at this point, just to reiterate, these are just proposals. This is halfway through the process. The final proposal will be in the fall. Inevitably, if it's going to happen, as a way to pivot to your question, it's going to force all of us to at least come to grips with the extent to which we are willing to balance the me and the we. the extent to which we are at least willing to entertain notions that may take a little bit away of my largesse as a way to create a more equitable distribution of families' opportunities in schools. I haven't seen a lot of that yet. And that's because everybody likes to feel that everything they have is something that they completely earned, independent of anything else. Now, to be clear, I don't support any proposal that puts people in a situation where their kid is suddenly the only anything. Nobody wants to be the only anything. And I would like to think that in a city that had a population of 800,000 before the riots of 1968, and I write about the riots in this book, by the way, that then went down to 500,000, that is now back up to 600,000, that has a rising tax base, that has rising property values, that has different gentrification features in different neighborhoods that can either become a force for destruction or perhaps some new force for good, now does seem like a pretty good time to revisit these questions and figure out a way to get a little closer to a more equitable distribution of families. What will it take to do that? Some very hard conversations, some self-awareness, some really well-crafted policies, and a much... I write in the back of the book, and I'll finish with this, that I say that our democracy is something that we do, not something that we have. We like to think that a democracy is just something that exists and you vote and that's the end of it. But here's the thing. Democracy does not require that we all live in equality. But a healthy democracy does require that we share in a pretty robust common life. Independent bookstores are one of the remaining places where people can maybe come together and participate in a common life. It's a shrinking number. So can the charter school movement and the efforts in DCPS contribute to some sort of revitalized sense of sharing in a common life amidst all of the other things that are happening? I don't know. I think it's worth the effort. But again, the reason I wrote this book is we can't even begin to have that conversation until we're a little bit clearer on what's actually happening in our schools and what we actually want to be happening. What all of you just said when I asked you what do we want for these children, how do we create schools that fulfill that promise, not the promise that defined the schools that we attended. Anyway, I hope it's a conversation to be continued. Thank you so much for coming on a beautiful day.